Tuesday, Tes Zayin Shvat Tovshin Ayin Tes. We are in Teres Menachem, Sefer Mamorim Tovshin Yud Gimel. The Mamar Bis Tamas Tovshin Yud Gimel. We are on page Kuf Pei Tes. Four lines from the top. The line starts Lamed. We're at the full stop Vizehu. We are in the middle of the theme of Havaya ve'elikim kol echad. That the Eiris and the Kelim, the lights and the receptacles in the various realms are all one. As it says in the Pasuk, Ki Havaya hu ha'elikim. And it's in four levels. The Pasuk denotes Bashamayim mimal, al ha'oretz, val ha'oretz mitachas. The Rebbe is in the middle of explaining Bashamayim, being a reference to Atzilus. And the Rebbe explained how Havaya and Elikim, the Eiris and the Keli, are one. In what sense? In the sense that the Eir wants to be regulated by the Keli in order to fulfill its function of illuminating. Without the tzimtzum, without the limitation of the Keli, the Eir would not be able to be received by the one that it is intended to be received by the one that is intended, the intended recipient. And so to the Keli, the purpose of the limitation of the Keli is not to hinder the light, but rather it is to assist the light in achieving its purpose. The Rebbe then went on to explain that this is both in terms of the Chitzonius HaKeli and also the Chitzonius HaEir and the Pnimius HaEir. Not only the Chitzonius HaEir, the external aspect of the light, which is already, as we know, more related to the receiver. Not only in that, insofar as that is concerned, is the Eir and the Keli one, but even in regard to the Pnimius Eir, the internal aspect of the light, which is more related to the Eir itself, the light itself, rather than to the receiver, that too is regulated by whom? That too is Havaya hu elikim kol echad, the Eir and the Keli are one. And the Rebbe explained it first by bringing the metaphor of a Rav and a Talmud, a teacher and a student, where the teacher communicates an idea to the Talmud concisely. Initially, the Talmud receives what? Only the external aspects of the Rav's intellectual idea. But after 40 years, Lekoim Inish Adaited Rabba Adar Boim Shnin, as he brought from the Chazal and from the Pasuk, after 40 years, the student will be able to appreciate the depth of the intellectual idea that the Rav communicated to him 40 years earlier. And it doesn't need a new communication in order for the Talmud to receive that. Which means to say that the Keli contains within it the entire Eir, not only the Chitzonius Eir, the external aspects, but also the Pnimius, the depth of it. And at some point that becomes revealed, accessed and revealed by the Talmud. The Rebbe also brought then the Mamar Chazal, the saying of our sages, that a Rav shall always teach his student b'derech ktsara, in a concise manner. And the Rebbe explained that it doesn't mean that he should limit, he should only communicate some aspects of the knowledge, but not all, not the fullness. Yes, he should, but rather it means he should communicate it all, but in a short and concise manner, so that although the Talmud initially, the student initially understands only the external aspect of the intellectual idea, but embedded within that communication is also what? The transmission is also the full depth of the intellect. And it's dependent on the student to toil and to delve and ultimately to reach the full depth of the idea. Says the Rebbe on page Kuf Peites, 4 lines from the top, V'zeu gam achiluk, this is also the difference. Shebein hamemritz shebe Mishnah lahamemritz shel achris bebraisa cholu. Between the statements, the sayings in the Mishnah, to the statements, to the sayings to the teachings that follow in the Braisa and etc. in the Talmud, and so on and so forth. What is a Braisa? A Mishnah, of course, is a statement by the Tanoim, the Tanaic sages. A Braisa is also a statement by Tanaic sages. What is the difference between a Mishnah and a Braisa? A Mishnah was taught inside the yeshiva. A Beraisa, the word Beraisa means outside. It was a conversation that the Tanoim were having outside the yeshiva. So it has the similar veracity, but not quite as a Mishnah. Mishnah, obviously, because it was in the yeshiva and it was far more scrutinized, right? So it has more veracity. Where do we see that? For example, the sages of the Mishnah are called Tanoim. The sages of the Gemara are called Amoraim. In order to qualify as an Amora, you could not be unaware of any Mishnah. You have to be aware of all the Mishnahs, to know all the Mishnahs. Whereas a Beraisa, if you didn't know one or two Beraisas, or if you missed that, it wasn't the end of the world. Why is that? Because that was not, as it were, an official discussion that took place in the yeshiva. So what's the difference? Another difference between the Mishnah and the Beraisa is, Gemara says in Tainis, she'ilfa Omar, one of the Amoraim sages said, one of the sages from the Talmud said, he says, is there anyone that can ask me can show me a masnita, a braisa of Rab Chia and Rab Oishia, and I should not and I should not be able to show him where this is alluded to in a Mishnah. That I can find a Mishnah that is similar to that braisa, right? What does that mean? What does that mean? Even though, as I just explained in the Mishnah, some Beraisas are slightly different in the sense that the Mishnah was taught inside the yeshiva, and the Beraisa was taught outside the yeshiva, right? And it is obviously not as concise as the Mishnah. Nevertheless, Ilfa, who was a great scholar, said, I can find in every Beraisa, the ones that organized the Beraisas were Rab Chia and Rab Oishia, I can find every Beraisa, I can find its source in the Mishnah. What does that mean, Hainu? Even though the Mishnah was said in a concise and short manner, Ilfa was able to prove that the words of the Beraisa are included within a given Mishnah. Because of Rambam, as Maimonides writes in his introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, that the language, the expression the Mishnah uses is something short and includes many things. And the concise language of the Mishnah was explained elaborately, was understood to the Mishnaic sages in accordance with the sharpness of their brain. But it took some time, and then the Mishnah had to be explained more elaborately. The Beraisas with the Seftis, which followed by the Beraisas that were taught outside the yeshiva, the Seftis, the additions, etc., in accordance to the measure of those that are receiving it. In other words, the point that I was making concerning the Mishnah. What's the Gemara? The Gemara is the whole discussion on what the Mishnah actually means. What happened before the Gemara? The Gemara came about years after the Mishnah. What about in the time of the Mishnah? The language of the Mishnah was so concise and more to the point. The sages of the Mishnah had such a sharp brain that they were able to understand within that concise language the full depth and the full body of what was later required to have the full body of what later became all the explanations, the commentary, etc., the Mishnah, the Brais, the Sefta, the Gemara, and so on and so forth. For them, that short language included all of that. They were the authors of it, right? So what's the point? The point is that you could find a short, concise language, which on the surface would seem to reveal only what? Something limited, but really within that could be the full depth of knowledge, which is later on, which in later times would be necessary. You need a whole explanation and elaboration in order to explain that. But in that communication, in that Mishnah that the Tanoim communicated, that included the full body and the full depth of what they had in mind. So therefore, what's the point that I was making? When we contemplate this idea, we will have additional explanation into the subject of Havaya and that Havaya is Elikim, as it reflects in Eiris and Kalim, lights and vessels of the attributes, divine attributes. The Eir being the Seichel, in terms of the metaphor, it's the Seichel that the Rav is trying to communicate to the Talmud. The Keli being the letters, the language that the Rav is using to communicate the idea. Although that initially the vessels conceal and cover the internal aspect of the divine light, as mentioned before, that the energy, the light, the air contains two aspects to it, the chitzenis and the pnimius, right? So it would seem initially it reveals only what? The external aspect, and it conceals the internal aspect. Nonetheless, despite this initial concealment of the internal aspect of the light, through the vessels and through the external aspects of the light, which are revealed through the kelim, then it's drawn, it's transmitted onto the receiver at a later stage. After he's first initially received the external dimension of the light through the vessel, so eventually he receives also what? The internal aspect of the divine light. So what is the word? Move on. From all this it's understood, when we say that the Eir and the Kli, the light and the vessel, is all one, or Havayahu Elikim is another way of saying that the Eir and the Kli is all one. So it is so not only from the point of view, from the perspective of the Mashpia, the giver, the light, in other words, the Rav, but also from the point of view of the receiver. What's the pshat? From the point of view of the giver, in addition to the fact that relative to him, we cannot say that through the vessels his light has become contracted and limited. Why can't we say that statement? Because the Rav, who's making that concise statement of the Mishnah, for example, he articulated these words. The fact that the Makabel, the Talmud, is only sees in it only the external aspect of his intellect doesn't mean that is the case concerning the Rav. When he says those words, he sees the full depth of what he's trying to communicate. He also sees how it could be understood only in a limited way. But for him, that's not a limitation.
Why can't you, the Keli can't hold the whole...
Pardon?
You could also say that the Keli is not able to hold the whole concept. Therefore, even though the Mashpia is putting everything in, the Keli can hold the whole.
The point is that it could hold. And the proof is that after 40 years, as the Rebbe mentioned earlier, eventually, the Talmud does get to the full depth of what he tried to communicate.
Maybe he has to work on it to be able
he has to, but he has to work on it. But he doesn't need an additional communication. He doesn't need new kalim. He doesn't need new language to get to the full depth of the understanding. It means it's there in a concealed way. Because if it would not be there, then how would he come to understand that that's what he tried to communicate?
If you use a different motion, for example, like a microphone or a telephone, the sound gets scrambled. So it's not the sound anymore, it gets rebuilt afterwards. That's where we can't say, for a bracha, you can't use it and say, Amen and be Yotza. It could be a similar process as well.
But he's saying that's not the process. The process is that in that keli, in that language, is embedded the full depth of what is trying to be communicated. The proof he used was that you don't need additional communication. He's looking at the same language, and 40 years later, he appreciates it with a whole new depth.
Why do you need the 40 years?
That's another question.
But you're rebuilding it. There's a rebuilding of what wasn't. All right, what you're saying is what I understand. So just
40 years. The point of 40 years is let's not use. That's what I'll say. It takes 40 years to get to the full depth of it. But the point that Rebbe made earlier was that we have to say that embedded within the keli is the full body and depth of what's being communicated, because the Talmud will not need a new communication or new language to appreciate the Rav's full depth. It's the same language, the same communication that was told to him, that was communicated to him on earlier, which he understood then at one level, and at a later stage, he understands it and appreciates it far more fully. Where does that come from? It can't come from the other. It must be that it was embedded within that transmission. That's the point that Rebbe made. So what the Rebbe is saying over here is that when you say the Oid and the Keli are one, let's look at it from the perspective of the Mashpia, and let's look at it from the perspective of the Makabel. From the perspective of the Mashpia, certainly the limitation that the concise language puts on the idea is no limitation for the Rav. He is so clever that he's managed to use language which could be looked in two ways. You could see it more superficially, or if you work hard enough and you delve deep enough, you can see the full depth of the idea. So for the one that's communicating that language, the fact that by the receiver he can receive it in a limited way, does that hinder or does that conceal the idea of the mashpia from the mashpia's perspective? No. When he looks at that language, he certainly sees the full depth of it. So certainly from the mashpia's point of view, from the Rav's point of view, Havaya Hu Elikim, the Oid and the Keli are one. Right? The Rav mashpia, just like in the parable of the Rav, who is the transmitter. When he teaches his Talmud, his student, an intellectual idea or a halacha, and he teaches it to him in a concise manner, which the Talmud receives in a limited way. The Rav, the teacher, will see within it the whole full length of the discussion and the whole depth of the intellectual arguments. So therefore, certainly the contraction, the limitation of the keli, of that language, is certainly not considered what? A contraction and a limitation. So that's from the perspective of the mashpia. Even more so, and additionally, furthermore, since the whole idea, so in other words, from the perspective of the Rav, point one, why it's not a limitation, point two, why it's not a limitation. What is the point of the Rav teaching it to him in a concise manner? What is the point of the Rav using language which initially only allows the Talmud to receive the external aspect of what he's trying to communicate, and only later on to receive the internal aspect? It is for the purpose of not confusing the Talmud. It's for the Talmud to be able to receive it in stages, otherwise they'll be confused. What's the result? The conclusion must be that the kli, that the vessel, that the language is one with the light, with the idea, with the communication. That's from the point of view of whom? The Rav, that in these two aspects the Oid and the Kli are one. But in addition to this, even from the perspective of the receiver, from the student, even though that it would seem that there is a difference between the light and the vessel, between Havaya and Elikim, being that after some length of time, and after working putting in some work, and delving deeply into it, he sees and he finds in this concise language also what? The internal aspect of the light of the intellectual idea, Therefore, the end illuminates, proves also upon the beginning of it. Meaning to say, this proves that the contraction, the initial concealment, wasn't a true contraction and concealment. Why? Because ultimately, he could use the same language, the same transmission, in order to receive the full depth and appreciate the full depth of the intellectual idea. But therefore, so then Havaya and Elikim is also from whose point of view? From the receiver's point of view. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that in Atzilus, as the Rebbe just explained at length, Havaya hu Elikim. Havaya and Elikim are all one. The Eid and the Kli are one. Both from the perspective, both from in the external aspects of the divine light with the keli, with the vessel, and also the internal aspects of the divine light and the vessel, and not only from the perspective of whom, of the light, of the mashpia, of the giver, but also from the perspective of whom, the mekabel, the receiver. Then the Rebbe is going to go on the next section to explain how Havaya and Elikim are all one, Bashamayim mimal, beyond Shamayim, which is, of course, Keser. More about that, please God, on Thursday morning.